Howdy, students. It is October 6th, 2020, fall semester, Humanities 2. We're going through the ages of music pretty swiftly. We're going to take it up as far as we can go until I've got to switch subjects and go back to teaching the other things in the book. I know you're missing that book. But the stuff I'm teaching this week is not in the book for the most part, but it is in a couple of documentaries I'm going to have you watch, post them on YouTube, Origins of Rock and Roll, or I want to continue with that music documentary, how music functions. I think just helps put the pieces together, how we got from there to here and back again. When I last spoke to you, we were talking about the cultural shifts that are happening in the 1950s. And we've got a Cold War going on with Russia, or it was referred to as the Soviet Union. We've racial unrest in the country. We've got Jim Crow laws. That was an antiquated racist laws that a lot of the states still uphold. It was legal to lynch a black person in this country for looking at a white person, a white woman, for saying it happened in some southern states. The town could just take this person out and lynch them, kill them, hang them. And this was in effect up until the 1970s. And so things were very sort of shut down and uptight during the 50s, conservative times, but the arts were booming. And that's what happens in kind of repressed times. We're sexually repressed. Our parents, they don't have access to birth control, and so essentially in order to have sex, they're mostly they get married. And so a lot of people are getting married that barely know each other. And that's going to lead to a lot of alcoholism and a lot of divorces. And the baby boom was on, which is I'm part of that. My parents met, married, had 3 kids pretty quick, and then they got divorced later on because they don't even know each other. They're like utter strangers to each other. This happened a lot. Talk to your grandfolks about it; they'll tell you. Anyway, so in the 50s, television was starting to blossom, and it was starting to become an everyday thing in America. Most people can afford a television, black and white, of course. There was no such thing as color TV then, and all of a sudden, people start staying home in droves. They stopped going to the movies because you could stay home and watch television for free. There was 3 channels. That's all we had, was 3 channels to choose from, and the three networks: CBS, ABC, NBC. And you had an antenna on the roof, and you could get these channels, or you had rabbit ears. Talk to your grandpa folks; they'll know what I'm talking about. On their TV, and you watch these things. Sometimes as a family, you all couldn't wait to gather around and watch episodes of I Love Lucy, or Dragnet, or Gunsmoke, or Have Gun Will Travel. These are popular, culturally popular television phenomenon that was happening in the 50s. Plays were busting at the seam. Playwrights like Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller were writing plays that were getting world renown. Theater was taken very serious in these days, not so much like it is now, which is more or less an entertainment Disney ride. If you ever went to Broadway, you know what I'm talking about. Poetry is happening. Poets are coming around. We'll be talking about poets a little later, but people like Allen Ginsberg were writing their famous poems, Howl, and Charles Bukowski was starting to write his poetry, and it was getting noticed. And the novelists were writing Beat Generation novels, like Jack Kerouac, um, mainstream novelists like Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal and Kurt Vonnegut were actually in the mainstream. Their books were bestsellers, and they're people read in those days, folks. They read books, they read novels, and that was a very large cultural shift and in our American culture and worldwide culture, because now we can read about other cultures, and most people um, had at least a high school education, and um, but people are starting to go to college also, more so than ever before because of the GI Bill. The GI Bill came along for the GIs that had fought in World War II. Um, my father is one of those, and you could go to college. You can afford it for once. You could afford to buy a house, which you couldn't do before, because they gave out low college loans for veterans. You could buy a car or even two. And so the suburbs were starting, they were sprawling out from the cities. In the old days, you had to live next, very close to the city you lived in, where your job was, because there weren't houses out 10 miles away. Because how would you get out there without a nice car? And you could afford those houses anyway. That's where the rich people lived. But the GI Bill made it possible for people to own a home in what they referred to as the suburbs, and that's where people were living, not downtown anymore. Unless you're, of course, you're living in New York City. Even in New York, they had the huge subdivisions out on the outer skirts of New York in different boroughs, and people, you can raise your kids out there. Far supposedly no crime. It's mostly white people that were living in those areas, so you don't have all the racial issues. It was called white flight, but it was happening in all cities and small towns in America. All of a sudden, an average family who worked an average job, you worked at the mill, or you worked for the power company, or you worked for an auto dealership, you owned your own business. You can actually afford to buy a house, support 2 or 3 kids, and get a car, maybe two. Because every once in a while, the wife's got to go out and do the shopping. For the most part, it was pretty male-dominated culture. The women were mostly relegated to staying at home, housewives, and the TVs reflected that. The dads are bringing home the money, and they're going on to their jobs in the world, selling insurance or real estate, doctors, lawyers, what have you, police chiefs, and they were bringing home the paycheck. And the wife was cleaning the house. Oh, yes, lots of house cleaning, and raising the kids, feeding them, and keeping them happy and safe, and maybe having to drive them to and from school, pick them up. They were run ragged. The husbands would come home and have a cocktail. The wives were not in the mood for that because they were exhausted, and so there was a malaise in the country and the culture. There was an unfairness to it all. A lot of alcoholism was happening because the World War II vets were suppressing post-traumatic stress disorders. This is long before we talked about everything, long before we knew why people were behaving the way they were behaving, is because they had been in combat for years and they'd seen some horrible stuff, and you just can't shut that off and come home and act like you didn't see some stuff. And so a lot of males of that generation, my dad included, were drank the pain away with liquor and as much as they could get down, and having a cocktail or 2 or 3 before you go to bed with maybe a couple cigarettes was par for the course. And Sometimes the wives joined in, sometimes they didn't, because they were exhausted from having to raise 3 kids essentially by themselves. It's so different now. It's so different now. People having children, it's so much more equal in a lot of ways, with the fathers and mothers are equally caring for the child, equally taking time off from work. But still, there's some unfair stuff still going on, where the woman is expected to take care of that kind of stuff. So this was a breeding ground for art, and art was changing. Like I said, the literature was changing. Music was definitely changing. We're on music now. Painters were living in New York. People like Jackson Pollock and Von de Kooning and Andy Warhol were starting to make a huge impact on our way of seeing things. And they were drawing in a manner called abstract expressionism. And they weren't drawing realistic paintings of nice sunsets and stuff. They were painting supposedly what we're feeling in our insides, the rage and the sorrow and the loss and the shattering of dreams, or the accomplishments of dreams, were in these paintings. And so for the first time, the painters were painting what people were feeling. Sometimes it wasn't pretty. And so they weren't pretty pictures to hang up on the wall. They were trying to make a statement. Well, music was doing the same thing. Rock and roll is a phrase that was coined supposedly by a disc jockey in Cleveland. Hang on. And who was later taken off the air for what they was called payola, and that was a normal way to get your record played on AM radio. Was powerful in those days, not like it is now. And how did you get your record played? Well, the person who is selling the records to the public comes into the radio stations and gives the director or the disc jockeys some payola. It could be money, it could be drugs, it could be free dinners down at the Howard Johnson's. It's illegal. And they would promise to pay the records. That's how it goes in those days. And still, a lot of times, we don't like to think of it, but it's maybe goes that way sometimes now even. Payola is illegal. And he was brought down. I'll come up with his name in a minute. I'm completely drawing a blank on his name. But he coined this phrase. It was a mixture of black music mixed with country music, mixed with a big band beat. And at one time it was called beat music. They tried to come up with a term. And rock and roll, it was rocking and it was rolling. And one of the first big hits of that era was by a band called Bill Haley and the Comets. And they had their huge hit called Rock Around the Clock, which was used for the first time in a Hollywood movie called The Blackboard Jungle with Glenn Ford. And if you ever seen a YouTube clip of Bill Haley and the Comets, they're pretty safe. It's like a middle-aged man out there in a suit and tie with a spit curl. He's not Elvis, folks. He's not Chuck Berry. He's not rocking. His band rocked, but he wasn't rocking. But they toured Europe and they put rock and roll on the map, and people wanted to hear more of this music. In the meantime, in the South, blossoming artists like Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and of course Elvis Presley were on the rise, and they're taking the music that they grew up with, which was black gospel music, and the music they heard on the country stations in those areas from Nashville to Memphis to Louisiana, and it was a melting pot for several different types of music, blues, and it was bringing into this fruition that became rock and roll. Um, Elvis took what the genius of Elvis was, besides he looked great, he also had a phenomenal singing voice. He did not write his own songs, but he took other people's songs and he put his own stamp on them and made them his own. Now, most people don't even know that he didn't write those songs, but he didn't. But his earliest songs, like Blue Moon of Kentucky and A Hound Dog, were written by artists from that area. And he would take their original thing and he put the stamp on it. And he usually had a good beat. Usually was played with a guitar, electric guitar, and bass. And that became sort of the calling card for rock and roll, those instruments. Before electric guitar became so dominant, the dominant lead instrument in early rock and roll was the saxophone. Why, you say? Because it cut through the sound. It was a loud instrument, louder than the piano. Piano, Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, they played great piano, but it didn't cut through like the saxophone did with the primitive microphones and PA systems and amplification they had in those days. Suddenly, when Elvis recorded his songs, people from around the country, the records were starting to get played on white radio stations, and people thought Elvis was black because that's what it sounded like to the untrained ear. That's what white people were used to listening to. That's what black music sounded like, and they were shocked and dismayed when they saw it was this beautiful white guy singing. Now they're going to flock to it like crazy. Other artists who were writing these great songs, like Little Richard and Chuck Berry, their songs were not getting famous by them because they were black after all. And so they're not getting on the television, but other white artists are. People like Pat Boone was considered as safe as mother's milk, and he took some of their biggest songs, Tutti Frutti and other ones, and he made them hits. Now you listen to Pat Boone sing Tutti Frutti, and if you listen to Little Richard, who wrote it, sing it, it's a worlds of difference. Pat Boone's is very safe and it's nice. It makes mothers smile, white mothers, but there's nothing sexy about it. There's nothing raw about it. There's nothing kind of naughty about it. And rock and roll is supposed to be, some people felt it was the devil's music. That's all racist terminology, but that's what they felt. The jungle beast in all of us. And what do we all want to do? We all want to get drunk. We all want to dance with somebody and maybe even have, hate to say it, maybe have sex with that person, and we're not married to them. That's what rock and roll did, and people rebelled against it. The straight religious communities banned rock and roll in a ton of cities because they felt it was corrupting the kids. Did it? To me, the kids always were corrupted. They just were looking for an outlet. And an early outlet for teen started in the jazz, the Roaring 20s, the big band era. My mother's generation loved to dance in these dance clubs. And that's all because there was not much sex going on without marriage. And so you could dance your physical sexual desires away by exhausting yourself. And so they danced like crazy. Well, folks, rock and roll makes people dance like crazy. You've maybe heard of Dick Clark on his legendary Stern American Bandstand. He played for like 30 years in this country every Saturday, I think. Started in Philadelphia, went out to Hollywood eventually, and he would have, you can look at it on YouTube. It went from black and white to color, and he went from Jerry Lee Lewis to X, one of my favorite punk rock bands. Wow, who would have thought? Anyway, so he was pretty progressive. The bands he had on there, and it was a time in our history before we had social networking and YouTube and all this other stuff that there's very little to look at. So you weren't giving a lot of choice, and so you watched that. Another legendary TV show was the Ed Sullivan Show, and that always showcased um, the newest music, showcased Elvis, it showcased the Everly Brothers, it showcased the Beatles, Rolling Stones, The Doors, and on and on. I think it went off the air in about 1973, and that's how we saw Elvis and the Beatles the first time was on Ed Sullivan Show. We'd heard about them, maybe seen a picture of them, maybe even had their album, but we never saw them play live until those shows. There were other shows at the time, Steve Allen Show. There was other shows, but not as popular or as critically acclaimed as Ed Sullivan. If you got an Ed Sullivan Show, it can make your career easily. Comedians, singers, musicians all made huge career strides, from Lenny Bruce to Richard Pryor on the Ed Sullivan Show. People religiously watched it. Came on at usually at 8 o'clock on Sunday night after Disney. Came on at 7. Then he'd watch he'd watch Ed Sullivan at 8, and then he'd watch Bonanza at 9, folks. That's how life was. Simple and clean, and everybody tuned in. And so rock and roll started getting big when Elvis Presley shows up on Ed Sullivan. Now, he was already known for being a naughty boy when it came to his movements. And so they didn't want to get the girls all riled up. They kept the camera above his waist, because what he was doing below his waist was he was doing some shenanigans with his movements, and it was too upsetting to the censors. And it was too upsetting because the girls were actually fainting. They called him Elvis the Pelvis, folks, because he knew how to move that pelvis to the rock and roll beat, the savage drum beat that every parent was terrified of. And other people were coming around the same time as Elvis. People like Little Richard, who was a black evangelical, and he was without Little Richard, folks, there'd be no Prince or Jimi Hendrix. He was flamboyant. He definitely presented himself as, without using the word gay, he was very flamboyant in a feminine way. He wore his hair that way. He wore makeup, and he went crazy. And he knew how to rock the joint, and he knew how to get everybody dancing in a naughty way. When you go to a Little Richard concert, you will be having some naughty activity, usually with somebody, hopefully, if you're lucky. And same thing with Elvis. It was hard to keep down the kids' youthful exuberance when they saw these acts. It was playing into the hormonal growth of adolescence. Plain and simple as that. Many are the artists, Everly Brothers. Without the Everly Brothers, there'd be no Beatles. The two brothers, Phil and Don, sang in these perfect pitched harmonies. Heartache, they wrote a bunch of their songs also, and that was a rarity. They're songwriters, and they had some hits, big hits, Kathy's Clown and other hits, and they're beautiful singers, and they look great. They had nice pompadour hairdos, you know. That helps to have the good looks to go with your music. Then on the other side would be of Elvis would be Jerry Lee Lewis, who was a piano player, and he was a wild man. He would get up on his piano keys and play and bang on the piano with his feet. He would do anything to get you rocking. And this sent a jolt through the culture of the day, and parents were not happy with it. And so when the parents heard Jerry Lee Lewis on your records in your bedroom, they would come in and say, turn that crap down. In my day, it was the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, turn that crap down. We all wanted to grow our hair long. We wanted to dress like them. We wanted to play guitars like them. Turn that crap down. I heard that all my life. It terrified our parents. I understand. Now I understand it. There's a ton of news music right now I don't like. Not because I don't, it doesn't, it's not rebellious. To me, it's just nothing. But don't yell at me yet. We're going to talk about contemporary music probably in the next lecture, and that'll be the last one on music. But I don't get it. I think it's boring and silly and disco-y. To me, people, and I know they have good voices. I'm not taking it away, but Lady Gaga and all that, it's Las Vegas show stuff. It's not rock and roll. It's not rebellion. It's look at my incredible outfits I'm wearing. Miley Cyrus, they all have really good voices, and I just think they're presenting themselves in a kind of corny way. I don't think it's not cutting edge. It's not punk rock. Not that everything needs to be, but sort of it does. Elvis was punk, folks. Beatles were punk. Long before punk, there was the Rolling Stones. They were punk, folks. And they pissed everybody off, except for the kids who loved it. And it was our music. And I think that's important when you're growing up to have your music as compared to your parents' music. And I appreciated my parents' music. They listened to Tony Bennett, Frank Sinatra, and Peggy Lee. I love all that shit. But it wasn't speaking to me like the Beatles did, or the Rolling Stones, or Elvis. And so there's always this natural divide, but I totally appreciate their music. Absolutely. Frank Sinatra was punk rock. He really was, especially in the 50s. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. So then we got these artists like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, who started literally, they were the template for rock and roll bands. Before this, we had singers. We had Elvis, who would strum a guitar. We had Little Richard on piano, and they would have backing bands. Buddy Holly and the Crickets had the four instruments that make up what all rock and roll bands are made of from that day on. 2 guitars, bass, and a drum. And he played guitar. And he wasn't just gyrating to this beat, the sound, like Elvis was. Chuck Berry played his own guitar, but he had a backup band back there. It was Chuck Berry in the front, whereas Buddy Holly was alongside his band members. And that was a game changer yet again. And just for a little trivia out there, folks, the Beatles took their name from Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They called themselves the Crickets. And so Beatles, they're not that much different, except for John Lennon's the clever one that came up with the spelling. Because, if you know your spelling, folks, Beatles is spelled with 2 E's. And he said, hey, this is the beat. We're all about the beat. And so spell Beatles with a A, B-E-A-T, beat. John Lennon was the clever one, folks. He was. So Buddy Holly was early on started that. Now, the tragedy of Buddy Holly may be a no. He was 22 years old, and he had just played a gig. I think it was in Minnesota, some place where they're having a big snowstorm. And so he was going to take a plane to his next gig. People said, don't do it. But he wanted to get there anyway, so he got on the plane with 2 other rock people, Big Bopper, who was a DJ who had a big song at the time, Chantilly Lace, huge song on the radio, and with Richie Valens, who was a Mexican-American kid from East LA, and he had a couple of really great songs, La Bamba, probably his most famous one, and they all got on the plane. The plane went down. They all died. Buddy Holly was 22. Big Bopper, I think it was 29 or 30. I think Richie Valens was 19. I'd have to Google that, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't 20 yet, or he's just now 20. And huge loss in the music industry. How dangerous flying to these gigs are. Lots of people have died in planes since then. Most famous one band would be Leonard Skinner. The whole band crashed, and 80% of the band died on impact. Yeah, 2 survivors, members, and I think one of them's still alive and they still play. But the main band, this would be in the 70s, maybe heard their song Freebird, died in a plane crash. Otis Redding was killed in a plane crash. Patsy Cline was a famous country and western singer in the 50s. Plane crash. Jim Croce, who was a popular singer-songwriter dude in the 70s, who sang Operator, great song, and Bad Leroy Brown, killed in a plane crash at 29 years old. Ricky Nelson, who was huge in the 50s with Ozzy and Harriet, it was a TV series, and he had his own band. He had some very great songs, and he's kind of responsible in a way of almost starting country rock, but he had a great guitar player who's still around, became Elvis's guitar player. Ricky Nelson had some songs, really good ones, and he was killed much later on his life in the 80s. He was killed in a plane crash. You don't survive plane crashes, folks. So that's it. That's all I'm going to talk about right now. I'm going to post a couple rock and roll documentaries, kind of the roots of the rock and roll. I'm going to try to get to as much as I can this week, see how far we can get. I haven't even scratched the surface. And I will probably assign a paper. I will on Wednesday, or I'm sorry, the next class for you is Thursday. And it's going to be about music. I don't know what yet. So look at these. Go to, I'll post this stuff on Canvas. I'll post this on Canvas. I'm going to post the documentaries you should watch on Canvas. And I want you guys to start a discussion. The discussion would be, what is your relationship to contemporary music? And when I say contemporary, it's been born till now. What is your relationship to it? Do you have one? Does it mean anything? Is it just background music? Or are you really into it? Are you really into hip hop? Are you really into acid, trip, rock, house, acid, whatever the terms are now? Talk about it. Express yourself. And if you have some bands you want to talk about them. And maybe I can hate Led Zeppelin. How can you hate Led Zeppelin? Don't say you hate the Ramones or Sex Pistols. I'll take a personal offense to that. But it's easy to hate things. Open your heart, open your ears, and listen to what's going on out there. There's some great music still being made, a ton of it. Hopefully you're getting something out of it. Maybe you're making it yourself. Tell us a story that way. I'll post that in discussions. Make a comment and reply to 2 other people. I do look at those things. They're part of your participation, because I don't take roll, as you well know. How do we do that in these virtual classes? I don't like going on too long on these, because I know you guys get bored. If we're in class, we have 75 minutes. And I never spoke for 75 minutes, folks. I would usually speak for 20 minutes, and we'd show some documentaries. So that's it, folks. What else? Keep rocking. This too will pass. The pandemic will pass, but be careful. We just had a huge outbreak here in Shasta County. So be safe out there. It's not over yet. Even the president of the United States has it. So if he can get it, boy, can we get it. And he's got the best care. We don't. Maybe you do, but most of us have just ordinary care. So on that happy note, it's supposed to rain in about 5 days. Let's hope it does. Get rid of these fires once for all and have some fresh air to breathe. I'll see you next time. Keep rocking.